what eclipses mean really is up for debate, and I think that's maybe by design. That what eclipses mean in a personal chart. Chris Brennan talks about it being the great beginnings, great endings. But I think the through line of all of them is that there are, and it's an element of fate about things are happening outside of our control, which I think always happens. But during an eclipse moment, it kind of really hits it home of like, these celestial bodies are clearly moving and lining up with each other where they're getting our attention, and it's visible to us on Earth, and our perspective of what that means varies. So I think that in itself is the introduction. Like, hi, everybody, welcome to No Dumb Questions. We're just talking about eclipses and like, how do you even get into that? What does it mean, and how do you see it in a natal chart? I'm Christa of Practical Astros, and I'm here with my astro bestie, Sonia of Celestial Astrology. And the idea of No Dumb Questions is to answer questions that people have about astrology, and eclipses are just so beautifully multifaceted that it's hard to fit it into a 30-minute episode. So we're not going to get it into 30 minutes. I hope that we get it in under an hour. And the idea of it is that this is a conversation. I was telling Sonia before we started recording is that eclipses and the nodes, which are the nodes of the moon, were my very first astrology class decades ago. And I still don't feel like I have a real solid grasp on them, because I feel like they undulate and they change my understanding and the context of how eclipses show up in birth charts specifically. They continue to evolve and grow and slither around. We have moved from the year of the dragon to the year of the snake as of this morning. And so it feels appropriate that we're going to be talking about this undulating, wandering movement of the moon and the moon's relationship to the earth and the sun, and how eclipses are made, and all that sort of thing. So with that introduction, hi, Sonia, thanks for joining me for this conversation. It's not going to be a full treatise on eclipses, but it'll be just what you and I kind of observe. And Sonia made all these really beautiful slides, and we'll go into some charts. So welcome, Sonia.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So can you tell me about this graphic here? I love old woodblock prints, and this is awfully cute.
Yeah, I just wanted to show how like the way that we describe them has changed sort of over the years. I mean, originally eclipses, they're like, if you go back to Mesopotamian times, that was the first time that astrologers made recordings of eclipse events, and that was on the, I'm going to say this wrong, but cuneiform tablets. And it was when they observed that 3 kings died. And then we've got this one here from 1711, and it's closer to the kind of graphic that we're used to seeing, but it's still quite complex. Even as an astrologer, I'm kind of looking at it and saying, right, so this is there and that's there. It's still quite hard for us to decipher, but I just like the faces. So I thought it was a nice introduction of, okay, we've just got to get ourselves grounded in where the moon is, where the sun is, and where the earth is. And it's different and changing for each of the eclipses.
And in middle school, I did the classic thing where you're supposed to do a science experiment, but I just did, I built like an example. I wasn't actually experimenting anything, but I just really wanted to build a solar eclipse machine. And so my dad helped me because he's an electrician, and we had, these different bodily orbs, and we had this rotating light that was the sun on like a canvas, and it was a great like display of an eclipse, but it wasn't experimenting anything. I'm sure they probably still have that in their garage somewhere. Okay, so then we move to 130, 40 years later, we have this figure that's a little bit more about what we still kind of view eclipses as. Do you want to talk about this graphic?
Yes, this is 1849 now, and a book on astronomy by Asa Smith, and like offering us a definition as well, that an eclipse is a special event. They're quite rare, especially to see one is even more rare, because they're in different places around the globe where they're actually visible to us. But it's when one celestial body, a planet, and obviously for us it's the moon and the sun, but we've also recently had Mars occulted by the moon. So it can happen to other planets. It's just obviously the eclipses that we talk about are the sun and moon, our luminaries, and they occur fairly regularly, usually every 6 months in pairs. And those are the most common time common types of eclipses that we see here from Earth, we can see them clearly. There'll be some
Yeah.
part of Earth where that solar eclipse of the sun going out during the day is dramatic and observed, sort of even if it's a partial eclipse, it will be visible to someone somewhere. And the same with the lunar eclipse at night. If the moon's visible because it'll occur on a full moon, it'll be visible somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I found, having observed both with my own eyes, absorbing all the baleful rays from an eclipse, when it's daytime and the moon, occults the view, and you start to see the light shadows of like a crescent moon through the trees on the ground. The experience of it, seeing with your own eyes, is very strange. Like even the animals and the birds and everything kind of stop. Like there's this moment, it's palpable, so it would get your attention. And I imagine that, hundreds of years ago, if you didn't have access to even, prints and books like this, that, if you were a learned person and could read, and or not even of a scientific mind, if you experience witnessing an eclipse, it would get your attention for sure. And it would seem rare, because it is rare for you to visually see something with your own eyes, depending on where you are on Earth, even though they happen in pairs, every 6 months. So just the magic of them all is a shared experience. Yeah.
And that's what they believe a lot of these ancient stone monuments like Stonehenge were built for, to actually time eclipses so that they could predict them more reliably.
Yeah.
So how amazing. We've got software now, but they transported these stones over hundreds of miles, these huge blocks of stone, and built this, and it just blows your mind, sort of the accuracy that would have been needed as astronomically to be able to get that up, and the fact that there's many of them around the world.
Yeah.
So different cultures as well have the same ideas that weren't in communication with each other. All had their own form of that.
Yeah. It furthers that it's such a shared collective experience, and that it's auspicious, that when it happens, it's out of regular time. So here's a beautiful, nice little easy graphic that Sonia made. Solar eclipse happens when the moon here passes between the Earth and the sun. So it blocks the light. When I've experienced them in life, it's been kind of like this orange. It's almost like the air gets suspended and turns orange, because it's like blocking the light, and until it gets almost dark, like completely dark. You can still see things, but everybody looks like they have like a David Lynch filter on them. Like everything has like this complete like dimming of the light. And the annular solar eclipse, you can see the corona of the sun. The total solar eclipse, it blocks out the maximum amount of sunlight. So I think in April of 2024, we're recording in January 2025. It was a partial solar eclipse that was visible in North America, I believe. Have any more to say about just the types of eclipses here?
Yeah, just I've spoken before about how important the luminaries were to our ancestors, like the sun and the moon. And like for me, my grandparents grew up without electricity, and my mum and my dad also saw the introduction of like that electric light into their homes as they were growing up. So in our DNA, we've got that link to the luminaries as our light. So lives being ruled by the light of the moon, full moon times being a time when you could go out and be more sociable, and the sun and the seasons ruling life. And we've become a little bit detached from that in our lives, and we're more ruled by our laptops and the clock and our phones. But our DNA is still very much linked. Everything that's in our blood is linked to their experience, because it's only a generation or so back that had this electric light. And you can think back to your own ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, and think about which generation did that come in, where it was, although electricity was invented further back, it didn't become normal in normal homes. So if there wasn't street lights, then it wasn't in your home. It didn't actually affect people's lives. So to have the sun go out during the day and for it to become dark would have been a really significant experience.
Yeah.
And we've got to think about what that means symbolically as well. Like we say with the computer, have you turned it on and off again? And it's amazing how many times that can actually work when you remember to do it and actually fix something. But it's kind of symbolic of that in our own lives, that something's turned off and on again. That the sun goes out and it kind of closes a chapter. And when it comes back on, you're in a new place, a new chapter's open.
Yeah. That's a beautiful way to put it. Another argument to sleep in as dark a room as possible, because I feel like just having, when you have that own lunar activity, reducing light as much as possible really does help for best sleep. So sorry to all you graveyard workers out there. Graveyard shift workers. Okay, so do you want to talk about this one here?
Yeah, so the annular solar eclipse, I mean, there's different types that we might see, but it's mainly because it's got this graphic that shows the sun, the moon, and the earth, and how the moon is in between and casting a shadow, and the intensity of the shadow. You can see the orange shadow that's coming, and then a wider dark black shadow. But from Earth, our perspective is that moon completely covering the sun, but leaving that beautiful aurora that can look like a ring of fire, they call it. Which is so amazing if the people who've managed to get beautiful pictures. But yeah, it's not a full covering. And again, that's about the distance, the longitude and the latitude where they meet, because we have these, people wonder, because we have full moons and new moons every month. So why isn't everyone an eclipse? And it's because they meet at the longitude. Not wanting to get, I'm not too great on the whole astronomy of it, but when we get an eclipse, they've met by latitude as well. So it's longitude and latitude mix. So they completely align in that way. And that's why you get these shadows cast and the Earth there. But it's from our perspective. If you go to Mars, you're not going to get the same eclipses. So all this talk about other planets, it's going to be a completely different timing event. And they wouldn't have the pull of the eclipses that we have. Like how that would work.
Yeah.
The chart would be a whole different thing.
Mars astrology. Next up.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have the penumbral lunar eclipse.
Yeah. So again, this is a different one here. The moon is passing through the Earth's outer shadow. So we've got the Earth in the middle now, between the sun and the moon. So lunar eclipse is occurring at the time of a full moon, where the moon is usually opposite the sun and reflecting the sun's light. So it's full and bright in the sky. And then the Earth passes, and that's what creates the shadow. But quite often, as you can see in this example, the moon is slightly off to the side, and we'll see that in charts. It depends on the degrees. You know, the closer the degrees are, is the more chance of a total eclipse.
Yeah.
Eclipses can be anything between 10 to 18 degrees away from the actual nodes, but the closer they are to the nodes is the tighter it's going to be, and the more chance of it being a total. But we're more likely to see these penumbral and partial eclipses where there's a shadow and it might just dim a part of the moon.
Yeah. Okay, here we are.
Little visual.
Eclipses in action. So we are going to start with this chart here, and we'll talk about, you know, if you have in your birth chart, you know, your luminaries near the nodes, then depending, like what Sonia was just saying, depending on how closely tight they are, it indicates that you were born near an eclipse or right on an eclipse. We're going to look at Prince William. This is his natal chart here. So do you want to dive in just to show examples of how eclipses can show up just in everyday life, and especially with birth charts, and how when you're born near an eclipse or on an eclipse, how eclipses really do signify big changes and crossroads in your own life afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what we spot, so we look for with the eclipse, we've got the sun and the moon together. So that's indicating it's a new moon. So I always think of like a seeding point here, like a new beginning, a new chapter, if you like. And we quite often talk about plant cycles, but if you think of the new seed is planted, you don't really know what it is yet. And we see that in the 8th house, we can see the sun and moon are together with this north node, which looks like a little headphones, like
Mhm.
Christa's wearing.
Yeah.
It's that kind of, that's how I first recognize them. And when they're this way up, so Prince William's sun, moon, and the north node is like containing the energy, is the way I think
Mm.
of it.
Mhm.
And that can be linked to, I mean, I went through yesterday in my prep all the different theories that you can find on what the nodes can represent. And there's
Mhm.
like different traditions like evolutionary astrology and modern astrology, and we practice Hellenistic astrology. But to cut it down to its essence, you're looking at increase. And the North Node, in a way, being linked to the way that the planet Jupiter operates. So if you think of, if you understand how Jupiter operates and increases, and then you need to understand that Jupiter can increase for good or bad.
Right.
It doesn't discriminate.
Yeah.
So whatever it touches, it will increase. Um, so there's a lack of control sometimes in terms of, or for us, of how these events may manifest, and they can speed up. So we often see these signatures in the royal charts, and it's fascinating, the British family history, because Charles and Prince William started a new kind of chapter from his mother's history, but
Mm.
eclipses were still linked. There was three kings between Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth. So you had the two queens as the book,
Mhm.
and then there was three kings that all died and ascended on eclipses.
Wow.
So it was in their death charts and also their ascension charts. And
Mhm.
then Charles and William have now broken this mold, and they're being born on eclipses. So it's like a shift to a new, again, a new chapter even of that.
Mhm.
But this Cancer Capricorn axis it runs through all of the British family charts. It's
Mm.
prominent. It's either on the stakes, or as you can see here, it's the eclipses, and also his luminaries are in Cancer.
Mm.
So we see it here for William in the 8th and the 2nd. So that's about like karmic debts. It can be like what you inherit from other people, and like your ancestry coming back, and what you're asked to do, that's about what's happened with them. The what you're being passed to resolve,
Mm.
that's accumulated in maybe previous lifetimes, if you believe in that. Or it can just be inheritances. And we saw that Prince William inherited a significant sums from his mother and also from
Mhm.
his father. When his father ascended, he became Prince of Wales. And that comes with like chunks and chunks of British land, land in the UK, land in Wales, land in Scotland, land in Ireland. It's like a really significant inheritance, but he's a like protector of it for future generations.
Mm.
So that really speaks to an 8-2 axis, where the two
Yeah.
is about resources and resources that come to you. Um, and the South Node can speak about decrease as well. So that could be over his lifetime, possibly we might see a decrease, or him maybe giving away some of that. We've yet to see. Obviously, he's got plenty of his life to live out, and plenty of times that those eclipses will be activated. Um, but as planets move and transit, they will activate those eclipses, and events may transpire that we see come through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting just to see that a North Node in the 8th house for a royal family member, because you are, heavy as the head that wears the crown. Like there is so much that, is, if you look at it as the crown, like being headphones being placed on them, all of that karmic um, weight that, his, maybe his soul chose by being born at this moment, if you believe
Mhm.
in that choice, but that it was just put upon him, and that's one of the things that he carries. And with that comes, yes, inheritance, and kind of I like the stewardship of a North Node in Cancer, of tending to and kind of being that caretaker that
Mhm.
the moon rules Cancer and Jupiter exalts there. It's about life. And so like caretaking and tending to that life. And, as a new moon in Cancer with the node pretty close, of hopefully beginning that cycle of nurturing life, and, whatever you think about the royal family, the new generation does have more of an action of preservation and taking care of the land and being less about just straight up being the royal family and more about being stewards. And again, like there's a million different opinions about the royal family, but as an American looking from afar, that's kind of as I've grown up, because I'm about the same age as Prince William. I've seen this, at least the news that travels, across the way to us is that there's more of even King Charles has that, more of an idea of stewardship to the land. So, but then also, his mother, are we going to look at her chart? What's the next one up?
His wife and his father.
Okay. Well, his mother, I know, is a Cancer sun. And so like so much of the significations of the eighth house, some people call it the house of death. From our Hellenistic point of view, the seventh house is because that's where the sun merges. It's where the sun sets. It's the western horizon. But the eighth house looks upon the seventh. So it's like the anxieties and the hardships around mortality and death, and just understanding, the tragedy of losing his mother. I do feel like it's tied into that, those eighth house luminaries and that north node there.
Yeah, but it was interesting because Diana, I did have some dates for Diana. Her life story as a royal was very tied in. They married on an eclipse, which I've got the chart for. Sadly, she died on an eclipse.
Yeah.
But also she published her book, her revelatory book, The True Story of her, was published on an eclipse, and it led to their separation 6 months later on an eclipse.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah.
So the story is there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just mother karma, with the eclipses there and the Cancer house for him is pretty loud for me. Okay, so then this is his wife.
Yeah, and unfortunately we don't have a exact time for her. There has been talk of somebody having a time, but nobody's been able to totally verify that it was correct. So this is the time that Nick Dagan Best has chosen. I've got his database of charts, so I've gone with the time that he uses. And what I really love about this is where the moon is placed in the third house, in its joy, in the house of Queens.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, if that time is roughly correct and we've got her as a Taurus rising, then it's as though she was born to be queen. This is the chart, reading the chart as it stands. This is a lady who was born on an eclipse, but we've got a full moon eclipse this time, where William was born on the new moon. So you see the difference now with the nodes are still on opposite sides, but we've now got the moon and the sun on opposite sides. We've got the sun in Cancer. And of course, the sun in Cancer in the ninth house is in the house of Kings. So in its joy, and maybe that shows up in the way that she's able to match William's purpose. They appear as equals. She doesn't, when they go out publicly, it's not like she's standing behind, but also she's not eclipsing him in the way that maybe Diana eclipsed Prince Charles.
It's sun in Capricorn. You said sun in Cancer, but I knew you were talking about
yeah.
Sun in Capricorn up in the ninth house. Yeah.
Sun in Capricorn. But yeah, it's there with the South Node. But Chris Brennan, when he talks about eclipses, he says you've got to really think of these nodes as a pair that are operating together.
Yeah.
Rather than focusing too much on, okay, the South Node's with the Sun and the Moon's with the North Node and delineating them separately. We've got to think more about the Cancer Capricorn axis, and that Capricorn being that steady building of something, and the Cancer being that family orientation. And we see how strongly she protects her family. And even like with the Cancer diagnosis, she wasn't going to announce it too early, even though there was such an internet sensation of where is she and everything. She announced her children had left school so she could tell them in a quiet environment that they weren't going to school and getting opinions, and then announced it publicly during the holidays so that the children were going to go into school. So she put her family first in that respect. So it's interesting to see that, but at the same time she is 100% on board with the royal family, and not all of the wives who have married in have been able to do that, to totally get with the program, to understand how the family is structured. And going back to William's chart, how he will be the head of the family. That that eclipse in Cancer for him shows him as the head of the family. But even the family members who are older than him will still have to report to him, and he has to give permission for their actions, because that's how the royal family works. The crown comes first.
Yeah.
So
And
the
so do
royal
you think that that speaks to the South Node being close to her son, like the son as her as the individual of acting as a drain or lessening then, like kind of taking her as the main character away in deference to the family?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of like her having an individual purpose is
Mhm.
kind of blended in
Yeah.
to this family enterprise that they have, and she's totally on board with it. I feel like that's what it's showing.
Yeah. So then we look at now Prince Charles or King Charles now.
Charles. Yeah. So he's dad, and we do have a time for him at 9:15, 9:14 in 1948 he was born. So he's a Taurus moon, which is nice because that's an exalted moon. So that kind of speaks to things being brought to you when you're exalted.
Yeah.
You can't think of any more than a prince who, like, if he decides to do a project, those resources are going to be made. You know, if he asks somebody to help him with a project or invest in a project, people are going to want to be associated with him. So seeing it up in the 10th house, it just made me smile, really. But again, we've got this full moon, and he was actually born just, I think it was 2 weeks before or after. Let me just check. Just before. So it was November the 1st was the Scorpio.
Oh, okay. So 13 days later.
Yeah. So he's like the exception that proves the rule almost. Chris Brennan and Nick Dagan-Bess were discussing this, and they said that usually that's like right at the far end of where you would count it. So Queen Elizabeth, his mother, ascended. Her father died, and she ascended on an eclipse. So Charles kind of breaks that pattern, and we start the pattern of the royals being born on an eclipse. But he's like right at the edge of it. And I wonder, maybe that speaks to him coming to the throne so late in life, I wonder.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, if you even just think of the prenatal syzygy, you know, that chart itself, the lunation that happened just prior to when you were born. So if you were born on a new moon, the full moon that happened before, you know, or vice versa, that chart itself is used by ancient astrologers to look at just the life itself. So you look at your actual birth chart, but then you look at the syzygy chart to then determine, and that would have been the eclipse. So that eclipse chart would be a part of his. But yeah, I think you're right on of having that delay in ascension to the crown shows maybe in that, like, he just made it in the door of being within that window, and barely made it in the door in his old age to be king, you know.
Yeah, but his life has been full of like eclipse events, so it certainly accounts.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Cancer Capricorn axis isn't strong in this chart, which many people do think means that he won't be king for long. You know, it's that could be one thing, because it's not the normal of the British royal family charts.
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned that he and Diana married on an eclipse day. That that his first wife, even though they were divorced, she died on an eclipse day. Her revelation of a book that led to their divorce was on an eclipse day. His first son was born on an eclipse. So, and then when he, did we have his ascension chart?
I didn't include that, but he was crowned on an eclipse.
On an eclipse, yeah. Yeah.
His divorce was announced on an eclipse. And I think there is a link to Camilla with an eclipse, but I didn't go that far.
Yeah. So it's clear throughout his life, he's lived a long enough life that we can see these events that reiterate that when you're born near an eclipse, even not even just on the same day, that eclipses are going to be significators of beginnings and endings of relationships and stages in life. And maybe we can talk about a little bit. Oh, this is their wedding chart, but a wedding is a clear signal that there's something different. The thing that can happen with eclipses that I've seen is that it's not always clear in the beginning. I mean, with a marriage, yes, you have a big to do. This was a very famous wedding. It was publicized. I mean, it was like all over the news. I mean, we still talk about this wedding, and to have something clearly marked on an eclipse with a televised version of that event, that is outside the norm, but it would make sense for these two individuals that are, clearly eclipse babies. They're going to do things publicly on eclipse, but just for you in your daily life, if you have eclipse signatures in your chart or people that you love, when eclipses happen, sometimes you're like, was that it? Like, what happened? And it can be incredibly nuanced in the moment. It's only on reflection we're like, that really turned things. And so it's good to note what you're doing if you have this in your chart, or you're just curious about where the eclipses are in your chart. So like, if are the eclipses happening in Aries Libra, are they happening in Pisces Virgo, what areas of life are they? And then note what happens around the eclipse for you, even if you don't have eclipses in your nativity or your syzygy, of what happens, because you can sometimes see it when you reflect back. It may be not as like televised and clear as like their wedding chart here, but it is a way to then use it just for your own sake, not just for talking about the royals.
Yeah. I mean, the royals obviously have those big events that we know the dates of, so they're easy to get the biography and get the charts.
Yeah.
And compare. And most people know who they are as well. It's not like I'm talking about a niche celebrity that you haven't heard of.
Yeah.
It helps really to have those charts that people have heard of. But yeah, it's really interesting to see that this was happening. And this is also an illustration of how transiting eclipses can work as well, because you've got the eclipse in the birth chart and the natal chart that we can identify an eclipse baby, we would call it, as somebody born on an eclipse, who's then going to experience those higher highs and lower lows as the eclipses move. But what we're looking at here is how the eclipses have moved around, and then a snapshot of one particular day in his life and where the eclipses were on that date. And it does make you wonder if the royals use an astrologer, that so many things happen on eclipses. Did they plan that? But then an astrologer wouldn't necessarily advise to do it on an eclipse because the energy is so unpredictable. Usually we hide. It's sort of a duvet day. It's not a day really to start launching something or anything. It's just a day to surrender and let things flow. So it's quite brave if you've got an astrologer to be choosing this kind of date. And obviously how events panned out, that's kind of underlined that as well. But we see the transiting eclipses in this outer ring. So in the inner ring, you've got Prince Charles's birth chart, which we've already talked about. And then on the outside is the wedding chart. And we see that the nodes were in Leo and Aquarius. And it's interesting because Leo tends to signify the royal center, like the center of power. And Aquarius is the collective, the people, generally speaking, symbolically, when you look at the signs. So Leo can be a concentration on one person, and Aquarius is concerned with all of humanity. And we know Diana was that person who was known to be the first person who went up and visited an AIDS ward and was willing to touch people, and went to the bombs site as well, very much campaigned for humanitarian issues personally as well, even though that hadn't been the royal path. Before that, they were cutting ribbons, not really getting their hands dirty in that sense. They were turning up at things, smiling and waving and leaving. But she would chat and sit down and touch somebody and hold her and, really empathize. So to see these nodes right on Charles's ascendant and descendant seems significant. This decrease maybe that the wedding brought through, the node being like representative of the south node, being representative of Saturn, of constriction and limits and removal of something in a Saturnian sign as well. And then this increase on his ascendant, did he, and also with Pluto co-present, did that reach into darker shadow sides of himself as well? Or maybe it forced him to acknowledge a truth where he hadn't fought to be married to Camilla. He'd accepted that he had to marry Diana.
Yeah.
Maybe that was when he realized that he needed to stand up to him for himself more, maybe to his parents, that times had changed, but it was obviously too late by the wedding.
Yeah.
There's a famous quote that Diana wanted to back out just before, and she was told by her sister, "You can't back out. Your face is on all the tea towels." Which is just so sad. It's like, who cares about the else? Don't. But it just is sad that she had those thoughts and had those reservations even before the wedding day, even though that didn't appear to be the case for us. We just saw a fairy tale wedding.
Well, it also speaks just to the sense of fate and tides that are out of your control that you really do have to surrender to, especially in eclipses. Eclipses are those moments that remind us of how much or how little control we think we have. We have some agency, but so much is just these winds and waves that move us around by fate. And the eclipses are like these reckoning points of fate. It's kind of like your face is on all the tea towels, like there's no backing out.
Yeah, that's it. Everybody who's around you is telling you you can't back out. Usually before a wedding, the family's saying, well, if you're not sure, it's okay. We hope they would be. But it's like, no, it's too late, it's done.
Yeah.
Which is difficult but sad. But we also see the other thing to bear in mind with eclipses is that the other astrology at the time matters. So they're not isolated events. They occur in tandem with everything else that's happening in the sky at the moment. It's interesting to see Venus there on his Saturn.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, in his resources. And also the Neptune activation. I think the moon is exactly squaring his Neptune. And then we see Neptune there with his Mars and Jupiter. So Neptune being confusion and delusion, and that thing of putting somebody on a pedestal, and you sort of think, oh yeah, with that wedding, it was that illusion of the fairy tale wedding.
Yeah.
And then the actual what was behind the scenes that we were only to find out later. So again, eclipses can be revelations of hidden information, but can be that seeding of that information that will come out over time.
Yeah. In retrospect, it's like we can see so much of it. I just see that, Venus in Virgo, Venus is in fall there, has to work really hard, and really has to kind of work through the idealization of Venusian themes, but then just to be conjunct his natal Saturn too. Like there's that bound of responsibility and limitations to that. Like it's a little heartbreaking to see in retrospect, that's when you're like, would an astrologer choose that? Or would an astrologer choose that to be like, well, it's bonification to his Saturn, So like maybe this will help him out a little bit.
Maybe you can only hope. But the Neptune Venus signature in his chart, that he's got that, how he relates to love is in that idealized, beautiful, romantic, dreamy fashion.
Yeah.
Which may be why he couldn't let go of the idea of Camilla. And it was obviously that Diana said that, she was always there present in their marriage, but really he would have needed to have let go of her and given his marriage a go if he committed to go through with it. I mean, again, opinions, everybody's got an opinion.
Right.
but what I'm seeing in the chart, stick to the astrology, is that, and also like a codependency you can get with Neptune and Venus, a codependency on your partner. So it can speak to maybe the way that Diana brought so much attention when they both appeared in public. Suddenly, he hadn't had a lot of interest before. There was like his Playboy days, maybe, when he became, just before he got married, when there was suddenly a lot of interest in who he was seeing. But before that, he'd been this awkward sort of gangly kid. Who's a bit of a nerd that there hadn't been a lot of interest in. And then after they were married, everybody wanted Diana. So it's like that pedestal thing of, maybe he didn't see Diana as she was, who she actually was. And also the same, you see that with marriage, Jupiter there, Saturn there, Pluto there. It's like, yeah, that's going to hurt.
Yeah.
And then his luminary tucked away in the 12th house. That's tough as well.
So so for the marriage chart, the ascendant is, it was Libra. Okay.
Yeah. So that would be the first house of the marriage chart.
Yeah.
But it was really sort of how you would delineate it, like as a transit for yourself. You would look first as to what signs are they occurring in. So here it's Leo and Aquarius.
Yeah.
And then you would look to see, are they aspecting any personal planets, any angles? And yes, it's within a range of his ascendant and his descendant. And then you would look to see, is it squaring? Yep, it's trining the nodes and sextiling the nodes. So it's bringing in that fated element.
Yeah.
No, it's squaring, isn't it? It's at the bending.
Yeah, because his node is in a fixed sign and the transiting nodes are in fixed. So
yeah.
It's at the end of the bendings because the nodes kind of move backwards compared to the rest of the signs. So the nodes would have started at 29 degrees Leo and moved this way. So prior to the wedding, he would have gone through all of the squares. So it would have squared his Chiron first, and then his Sun, and then his Mercury, and then his node, and it is moving into squaring his Moon. That's the last one before it moves back into Cancer, because so it's heading towards that Cancer Capricorn axis. Again, it's not that Cancer Capricorn axis is part of the royal eclipse lineage. It seems it's moving there. So he does feel just on the peripheral of this fate, still a part of it. It's definitely moving there, but it's catching his own exalted moon there, and an exalted planet might have things being brought to it, but it's not necessarily the things that you choose. And to me, that's what stands out with just his marriage to this woman that everyone loved. It's like, this is the greatest gift that we can offer you, Prince, like this beautiful, loving, woman that, but you didn't choose her. And so she might be the greatest gift that is given to you, which is kind of an exalted planet story. Things are just put in your lap. You don't really have to try very hard. It's the best thing that the others around you that care for you give you, but it's not necessarily what you would buy for yourself or choose for yourself. Or so there is that. It's a little bit of a spoiling of the planet, because you're like, well, this is great meal, but I don't really like Vietnamese food or whatever. It's like it has a little bit of a spoiling aspect to it. It can have that, so it's good to if you have a planet exalted, to appreciate the gifts that are given and understand the limitations. It's like, well, you're limited by the fact that you are given all this, and you don't want to seem ungrateful, which again, like, kind of speaks to his relationship with Diana. It's like, you should be happy with this woman because on paper, it should work, but it's not what his heart chose. And especially with that Venus there and next to Neptune, is to be lost in the idealization of that Libran Venus. It's he had an idealization of it, and the moon and Taurus can't see those Libra houses or those Libra placements. So it's like there is a disconnect there, and it's yeah. The little free chart reading for you, King Charles.
Yeah.
Sure you're watching this. Okay, so then on to Diana's death.
Yeah. So this is a hard one, isn't it, to see? But again, it's that 1-7 axis, but this time this is just the date, and it's not against her personal chart. So we're just looking at where everything was. But again, you've got the Sun, Mercury, and the North Node expanding. That sense of self, Mercury in its exaltation and its domicile, but also Pisces, that dreamy place, but a place without boundaries, on that 1-7 axis that they married on. in Charles's chart. So it wouldn't have been necessarily the same in her own natal chart. But again, sort of showing how close these events can occur. And you see sort of Mars in the third house. Quite often the third house can represent things like transit, and Mars representing a cutting off. So again, that's where you bring in what the other astrology is doing as well. It's not actually linked to the nodes, but we've got Saturn there in the 8th at 19, the node at 19. So they're in what would be called a quincunx relationship, which we don't recognize as Hellenistic astrologers, but you still can't help seeing that there's that disconnect, that difficultness between the malefics where they're placed, really. Mars being so close to the Sun and Mercury, and then Saturn just there on its own.
Yeah, I mean, what stands out of this chart is, okay, well, Mars is at home in Scorpio, and it's squaring that moon. You know, both of the malefics being in Mars temples. You know, the way that she died was, you know, it was through injury, and it was through, you know, like I think of constriction with Saturn, and that was part of it, is like being kind of bound by fame and by obsession of fame, and that you know, having a car accident, of losing control. You know, that's, to me, it screams that malefic, and the Mars and Scorpio squaring the circumstances of that 18-degree Leo, you know, royal moon there. So yeah, it's a sad one. I don't always feel comfortable looking at it too long, really. Yeah, because you don't want to just dissect someone's tragic end in a moment, but these things happen, and the astrology happens whether we pay attention to it or not. I think it's good not to get too involved in dissecting death charts, but they play a role, just as deaths are great endings for you know, for the person, clearly, but also just for storylines and lineage, and then they can be opportunities or great beginnings for ways to then not repeat it. You know, how we interact with what caused the death, whether it's an illness or you know, an illness of media in the case of her death. So on to equally morbid chart. Here is an eclipse in January of 2020, which 2020 we all understand as the beginning of COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so I've got like a timeline of dates and events of things that happened around this eclipse in the UK. But basically this was like the first introduction. So it kind of started around these 2 weeks before and after this eclipse on the 10th of January. We had the government, first of all, saying avoid necessary travel to Wuhan. Then 2 days later, avoid any travel to China. You know, so it was that gradual thing. And then 2 days later, we're evacuating all citizens. So it was like this process of, oh my gosh, this is getting real. At the beginning of January, you know, at first, the Foreign Office says don't travel to a city. That's not a thing. You know, you can look on a website,
right,
and there's loads of places we're told not to travel to, or we're advised against traveling to. But then suddenly it ramps up. We can't travel to the whole of China. It's like, that's big. That affects diplomatic relationships and everything. Suddenly it becomes much more significant. And then suddenly people are being evacuated out of China or out of Wuhan. And it's like that became a whole thing, airlifting them, and people who couldn't travel because of animals, or, you know, and that became like on the news, just these heartbreaking stories of people who couldn't get evacuated or couldn't miss the plane, and the admin of it and everything. So it was really significant. And then it ended that 2 weeks with the first case being found in the UK. So it was like really significant timeline for the UK here. But
so this eclipse is kind of in the middle of all that, right?
Yeah. So we're in the middle so that's like a 2 week timeline of events before and after, sort of ending just the 2 weeks around it, because the timeline obviously is much longer. It gave like a 6-month timeline to how things ramped up. But I thought, well, that leads from that first, best not to go to Wuhan, we think. to suddenly there's a case in the UK, we're bringing everybody back. It was kind of, okay, we're shutting ourselves down as a country sort of thing. And those people that were brought back were then isolated for a couple of weeks and tested and, TV cameras on them when they went into the facility where they were kept, and they were all being interviewed and everything. So it was like we hadn't seen anything like that before. So it was like really significant and memorable just watching the news every night to see the developments. When we talk about eclipses, sometimes they can be international events happening to the collective, but things can move really fast. So and it was like gathering speed over these 2 weeks of like going from something that was happening somewhere else in China to suddenly, wow, this is here. This is affecting people I could know. This is affecting my country. What do I need to do? It shifted in that 2 weeks to.
Well, what it reminds me of is like one of the graphics that we showed in the beginning of when the moon was in between Earth and the sun, and there was like this really concentrated shadow, but then there was kind of the wider shadow, and it's like you may not. And just thinking about the shadow as like spaces of time, it's like when that first shadow kind of appears, it may not seem to be that big of a deal. So you can't go to this one place in China that you probably would never go to anyway. To then being concentrated of like watching on the news, people going into a doctor's office. Like, why would you even want that? It's like because it has just intensified. It's like triangulated light or triangulated shadow into this one singular subject that we're all talking about. So it's like, and the speed of that happening, that again, upon reflection, now we all know Wuhan, China. We did not know it before because we looked back and we saw the context of this pandemic. So I think it's a great chart just to show that like things can kind of happen beforehand. Like the energies can start to shift. It's like that shadow first starting to cast on the earth may not be the most intense, but it is still a part of the contextual story.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. We see the south node there with Jupiter, and Abby Mishar was saying that like the north node is good with a good one and bad with a bad one, and the south node is supposed to be bad with a good one,
and good with a bad one.
Yeah. So to see the south node with a benefic is a portender of like something difficult, challenging, and Capricorn. The Capricorn-Cancer axis was thought by the ancients to be those portals by which spirits and souls came to Earth through Cancer, the portal of mortals, being the lunar realm, was where we would enter from the sublunary sphere or down through the planets, and we would enter through Cancer, and then we would depart this Earth through the Saturnian sphere of Capricorn. So yeah, to see that they were on that Cancer Capricorn axis as well was significant, but also that stellium of planets, and the node. I hadn't caught that before about the good and the bad with a good one, bad one. But yeah, once you see that, you're like, right, they're exactly conjunct. Well, 25, 35 minutes apart.
If you think of the south node as the drain of like draining any good that Jupiter in Capricorn isn't great because it's exalted in the opposite sign. It's exalted in Cancer, so it's in fall here, but it's still Jupiter. But then to have on top of that, it's co-present with its ruler. It's co-present with Saturn, as well as the Sun and Mercury and Pluto. But then right next to that south node as being, it's like it's draining as much, of the Jupiterian essence that it still has. At least it's within its own bound, so it's it has a little bit of dignity through the term, but then just to be so close to that south node at that moment, it really is kind of the loudest thing in the chart, outside of understanding like what happened, even after this. Like this is even before, this is like 2 months before like global lockdown, but it hints that that's coming. And so we're like 12 months away. We have this eclipse. This is just prior to the grand conjunction that happens like a week later between Jupiter and Saturn. But talk about this one here.
Yeah, this for us was like a difficult one because again, it was a significant 2 weeks. It was like 14th of December, so right in the run-up of Christmas, people had before then, people had made their plans who they were going to see for Christmas, and we'd had this like bubble thing where you were allowed to have your bubble of people that you mixed with, and that was okay. And they had a tier system of, if it was tier one, you were allowed to do this amount of mixing, and if it was tier two, so you were advised what tier your area was in, depending on what the risk was. And during this 2 weeks, most areas, or certainly the London and Southeast area where I was living, we went from tier two right up to tier four, which is total lockdown. But again, at the start of it, it was kind of like the beginning of the other set of eclipses at the beginning of the year, which was, well, it's not really a good idea. You know, we think people shouldn't really mix at Christmas. It's not great, because they'd seen what had happened in America at Thanksgiving, and you'd had a real peak of cases after everybody had mixed at Thanksgiving. And they were like, yeah, maybe it's not such a good idea to let people mix as freely as they were going to, because things were quite low at the time.
Yeah.
And then they were like, yeah, maybe it's not a great idea. And then it went to, okay, you're in tier two, no, you're in tier three. And then it was suddenly, no, it's tier four, you're spending Christmas on your own.
Yeah.
It was, again, it was just that fast escalation, whereas usually the move between tiers was slow. You know, it could take months to go up or down a tier. And also we hit 2 million cases during that time period as well. So it was significant for that reason.
It's an example of how the eclipses, outside of a signature and a nativity, can be collectively experienced. I mean, depending on even what country you were in, a version of this was happening. This happens to be the UK, and but this, it wasn't wildly different from country to country. Like Spain has its story, the US has their story, Australia had their story, but it did seem that it was it did ramp up right as Jupiter was approaching Saturn here. They conjoined at 0 degrees Aquarius, right? Like a week later. So really just as an example of a collective experience, eclipses themselves are collectively witnessed, and we witness just the mundane expression of this eclipse here is in the Sagittarius Gemini axis.
Yeah, and it's interesting with that Jupiter Saturn conjunction being in Aquarius, because that was a shift, like a longer shift over like a couple of hundred years of a change of them meeting in air, whereas before they'd been meeting in Earth signs. So that was like a really significant shift, but also to be at a time where we're experiencing an airborne virus as opposed to an Earth transmitted virus, bacteria in the soil or something that people were, that had gone global, the plagues and things like that were transmitted by rats. If you think of the type of illnesses that people had suffered from before, and then suddenly the global thing is about airborne, and the global pictures of everybody wearing masks, and it just like really drives home that this is the thing that's going to affect us going forward, and maybe for a much longer period, especially with Aquarius being fixed. Like I say, looking at the whole astrology of the chart rather than only the eclipse.
Okay, so then we are in 2025. So if you're watching this afterwards, just comment what year you're watching this. So we're looking ahead to this eclipse in March of 2025. This is going to be the first of the series of recent time, with the South Node now having moved into Virgo, the North Node into Pisces, of this first eclipse in this pair series that's happening March 14th, early in the morning in London. What are your thoughts on this one that's coming up for us?
It's really interesting because the Pisces Virgo axis, we've got Pisces is only going to experience lunar eclipses for the whole time. There's not going to be any solar eclipses there, which is unusual. So it seems significant. And then it's doubly significant because there's so much attention on the Pisces Aries border or the cusp, because those planets that we see at the time of this eclipse, Saturn and Neptune, are going to be moving across into Aries and then back this year. So it's kind of doubling down on that and really asking us, like with the lunar eclipses, it's like a letting go of something.
Hmm.
That full moon is like the culmination or the peak. So in a gardening analogy, it would be the flower that's at full bloom. But what happens after full bloom is that the petals drop off and everything sort of
Yeah.
decays down and returns to the earth, and the bulb or the tree will release its leaves and then it will regenerate over the winter and come back again in the spring. So it's like that releasing and letting go. And there's something about this Pisces place that we're, wherever that hits in our charts, that we're closing that chapter.
Hmm.
It's really those doors are closing, and we need to be willing to surrender and release in that area, I think, and that's really punctuated by the lack of solar eclipses, because the solar eclipse would bring in the new area and the new
Hmm.
seed, and it's like, yeah, we're not getting anything new coming in there. It's like
Well,
it's
it's
hard.
interesting because like having Saturn and Neptune move out of Pisces and into Aries, and then they'll retrograde back. You can see here, Venus is retrograde. You can see in
Mm.
Astro Gold when the number's red, it's retrograde. So it's it will retrograde back into Pisces, and Mercury will also retrograde back into Pisces, and then go forward again. So it's like all four of those planets are kind of stitching through their retrograde action the house of Aries and Pisces. Aries, the sun, when it goes into Aries, it's the spring equinox. It symbolizes the sun taking over. It's kind of the beginning of the zodiacal year. Pisces is the final sign of the zodiac, and so Venus exalts in Pisces. Partially, an explanation is because of how if Venus is represents love, and we can think of it as nostalgia and memory and remembrance, it is because it is that final sign. It's like where everything kind of settles, and to love something is to remember it and to hold on to the memory of it for as long, and intended to for as long. And so to have it only be lunar here is just really kind of a beautiful reiteration of the things that we remembering what we care about, why we care about them, holding on to the best of it all, the best story, so that the memory and the memory over infamy
Yeah.
with Pisces versus Aries, having all those planets kind of retrograding back over that line, kind of stitching those houses together, really anchoring it of endings and beginnings. So, March 2025 of this eclipse here, is this a great ending of sorts? Is this the beginning of how we reconcile some ending before we move on? Because the astrology coming up, like we're in it already, but the astrology coming up is quite different, especially those planets moving into Aries, Gemini, Aquarius. Uranus is going to be moving into Gemini, Pluto is in Aquarius, and then Neptune and Saturn going into Aries. Those are air and fire signs versus the earth and water signs that they've been in. So that just that alone is quite different than what we've had in the past. And so March of 2025, this eclipse here does feel kind of like kind of pouring one out for the homies, sort of like memory of what are we saying goodbye to? Can we hold on to the best things that we love? Because we're going to have to kind of fight different battles, when those planets go into Aries this spring. Oi.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting as well that the eclipses they come in pairs, so generally 6 months apart.
Mm-hmm.
But there's like this wobble of, so we did have a Pisces eclipse at the end of last year. So it's not the first,
Mm-hmm.
but then it moved back to the Aries Libra axis, and now it's gone fully into Pisces Virgo. So it tends to be about a year and a half that it'll be fully in Pisces Virgo, and then it will
Mm-hmm.
have that wobble again on the other side
Yeah.
as it moves on again into.
Speaking of the wobble, like so this will be the last one in Aries here. Like we've had the
Mm.
Aries Libra one, but this final one in 2025 that'll happen 2 weeks after the Pisces one will be in Aries. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
What are your thoughts about this one? We have the sun and the moon at 9 degrees Aries with
yeah.
a retrograde Mercury still holding on 28 minutes 0 degrees.
Yeah, it's really showing us what that cusp is about, like Mercury really communicating what that cusp is about, and maybe giving us an idea of what's coming up there. But yeah, like Christa says, it's the last one. It's showing us what an out of sign eclipse can look like. So it's another good example, because you can see that the node, the little headphone, is up there in the 9th house, and yet the luminaries are together as new moon in the 10th house. But again, it's the number of degrees that they're apart that matters, and the fact that they're meeting. And we should have said as well, these nodes, they're the nodes of the moon, and they're where the moon and the sun meet, sort of that latitude and longitude. So they're like an imaginary point or a shadow. Indian astrologers call them like shadowy planets. They're not an actual planet. They don't send light or rays. They're like a symbolic point. So this is like an out of sign, which is always even more tricky to delineate, because you've kind of got Pisces themes coming in as well as the Aries. But yeah, we've had like the 2 years, and this is what I was saying about the wobble. This is the wobble where you get some out of sign eclipses and a little bit of going back to finish up what we've been working on for 2 years, sort of in that Aries and Libra axis. And I know that Chris Brennan's talked before about this Aries Libra, and Austin Coppock has as well, being linked to the Israel and Palestine crisis and everything that's happened there, sadly, because the eclipses can talk of collective wars and just global events as well. So hopefully, with the ceasefire that's happening now, this will see a firming up of that ceasefire and a closure, certainly of this chapter of their story together. That's what we can hope for with this eclipse.
Well, and also we have the North Node next to a malefic and a benefic. And so the idea of, the North Node with the malefic, it makes, it's a good thing, but it's it's a good thing with a benefic and a bad thing with a malefic. And it's got both. Venus is retrograde, so it's a little closer by degree and by, just by degree. So like, to me, this kind of muddies it a little bit of like, well, what can we expect? Is there going to be like an increase of exalted Venus here in Pisces, or an increase of that forward Saturnian Saturn and Pisces element? I mean, I feel like it might be kind of a mixed bag, just having both of them right there next to it.
But that could speak to like peace agreements, in the way that Venus wants to bring people together in harmony, and Saturn does want the end of something, to bring something to a conclusion, and to cast it in something firmer, to make it a firm structure. So it could be like, if they're both increased, that coming together and peace talks actually becoming, because at the moment it feels quite fragile. But this could be like a real firming up around that time.
Yeah. Saturn is sextile Uranus, so things can just kind of come out unexpectedly, come out of the blue. Chiron is squaring Mars, so that's kind of like maybe even just speaking to some wound that we need to work on overcoming. So it's the end of this Aries Libra eclipse cycle, but it feels more like a beginning to something else. And just like the Pisces one is the beginning of that cycle, but it feels kind of like the end. So it's they're best viewed in hindsight. What happened just in your own personal life. And this is the last chart that we'll look at. Just thinking of it in your own nativity, where are these eclipses happening? And you can look at the house topics of those, the house topics of Aries, Libra, the house topics of Virgo, Pisces, and you can look at your own nodes, like where they are in your birth chart. Are you at the bendings? If you have cardinal nodes, but they're not, they're Capricorn, Cancer, and not Aries, Libra, then you're kind of at this bending point of your own nodal story. Are you having a reversal? Do you have the North Node in Libra and the South Node in Aries? You're kind of at this 9-year cycle, because they happen at every 18 years, where the North Node returns to the position it was in. it flips every 9. They go through each sign in about 18 months. And if you have a mutable nodal signature in your chart, like say you have the nodes in Gemini, Sagittarius, the nodes have now moved into the other mutable of Pisces, Virgo. So then you will become at the bendings, or, are you having a return? Are you around 18 years old? Or are you around 36 years old? I mean, you can look and see how that return is happening, and then, hire an astrologer to kind of project forward, to get some sort of an idea of maybe what to expect. But they're notoriously hard to predict. That by their nature, they are unpredictable. But it's not impossible. And sometimes it's nice to kind of, I find that a lot of people have lots of fear around eclipses, because it's a reminder of how are kind of just, we have to surrender to the fate sometimes. And that the fear comes up with feeling out of control. And a lot of times I pull on other divinatory prospects to help me navigate eclipses, because I find that it's helpful. I find that eclipses are really ripe for using occult practices, like even just prayer and meditation, to find comfort in the fact that, yes, we might not feel like we're in control, but not everything that is out of our control is inherently bad for us or causing us harm or wants to cause us harm. So if you find that you have fear around your own eclipse story, you can use your imagination for good as much as evil. and looking backwards on your own stories with eclipses, just to see, maybe you did have some big life changes, but how do you view them now that you're on this side of it? I'm going to open this up. Sonia reminded us of this website, timeanddate.com. So you can look at any year, at past or future, to see where eclipses will be visible. So we're in 2025. The partial solar eclipse will be visible here, and here you can see on the screen. And then the lunar eclipse in March, that the chart we looked at, will be visible here, and in September, visible here. So this is a nice website to kind of access. You can even just look in years prior and then years coming up, just to kind of see if you want to plan an eclipse voyage for your 50th birthday or something. You can kind of see where in the world that would be. So thank you, Sonia. Do you have any other?
Yeah, can I just add something that Dimitri George said?
Of course.
Which was, when the moon is within 10 to 12 degrees of the node, it's the image that she gave was so lovely, especially with like that dragon there. It's like you're tiptoeing past the dragon's lair. So it's like, proceed with caution.
Yeah.
You're in this difficult place. There's nothing you can do. You've got to travel forward, but just proceed with caution. And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. Just take note of your surroundings, take note of everything, watch out for pebbles that might trip you up, anything that's gonna trip you up or set you back, any sort of reversals, anything like that. But just imagine you're tiptoeing past this dragon's lair, and you do not want to wake the dragon up.
Yeah.
So
prioritize like, safety.
Yeah, it's like this beautiful image of, yeah, I get that.
Yep, I love that. The great DG.
Yes, yeah, she's lovely.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sonia. Do you want to share where people can find you and what kind of offerings you have? Do you have anything eclipse related that you offer your clients?
Well, I use them in my predictions. I will always look at where the eclipses are falling in somebody's chart, and then I'll ask them what was going on 9 years ago and 18 years ago to get a feel, and around that time. But also, Chris Brennan reminded us that it's not all of our chart is related to us. It can be other people. So say, for example, the 7th house could be your partner or people that you work with, or your close business partners. So you may think it hasn't happened to you, but when you look back, so that can be reassuring. If you're worrying about an eclipse, you could be looking, and it could actually be other people around you being affected. So I do use them in my natal work like that, and also in predicting, like you say, it's notoriously difficult to actually say this will happen. But you can see if it's a 10-4 axis, the career and home matters are activated, and then you can ask the individual what was activated 9 and 18 years ago, and you get an idea of how it's playing out for them. But of course, it's impacted by the astrology then, and it will be impacted by the astrology now as well.
Yeah.
Which helps. But also for me, I offer astrology readings and astro coaching. I love to go deeper into the charts and work with it to sort of make a practical difference in your life. Like, how are you going to use that astrology? It's one thing knowing your chart, but what are you actually going to do about it? Do you want to work with the moon's cycles or with Uranus transiting? So if there's something you really want to work with and use it to make a difference in your life, let's get to work with the astrology. And I will be offering a new reading, a more liminal meditative type reading, and I'm just still working out what date, but I think it's going to coincide quite closely with the eclipses, because the date I'm looking at is in March. Which is interesting because the eclipses do fall in my 10th house, so yeah, it kind of makes sense. But
yeah,
so that will be out around that time.
Perfect.
So watch that space.
Thanks. I will put in a couple years ago, their eclipses were happening in my 1st and 7th house, and I was straight up nervous. I was really nervous about it because I knew enough about astrology to be dangerous to myself. And but then I also started like a formal astrological education that year, and it really changed the way that I expressed myself to the world. I helped uncover this identity that I kept very close to the chest as Scorpio rising, and having the eclipses in my 1st and 7th was scary on the front end, and then on the other end of it, I was like, that's exactly what I needed to do. I needed to go into the dragon's lair and learn from the dragon to come out as an astrologer. So that I would do it all over again, even with the fear. So just that eclipses aren't always doom. They're maybe a death of an old version of yourself, which is kind of what I experienced, of being honest with who I was have always been with my relationships. It was the first self and the 7th of relationships of, and it also grew my relationships in the astrological community, which I didn't have before. I didn't even know there was an astrological community. Like it, it just did not occur to me. So don't fear the eclipses. Just get advice from an astrologer or just through your own guides and spiritual teachers that they're just these poignant moments to remind ourselves to maybe walk a little lighter if you're walking by the dragon's lair, and be aware of your surroundings and aware of your own capacity and keep moving,
And there's 4 of them a year, so we've all lived through many of them, and done fine even when we weren't aware of the astrology of them. So we've got this.
We got this. You got this too. All right. Well, thank you, Sonia, for joining me today, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, thanks.
Like and subscribe.